Alright guys, so welcome to another video. So this is part 3 of our OAuth2 Discord implementation. Okay, we're doing everything from scratch, and in this video we are going to basically save the user's session to a database. And I'm going to explain a little bit what exactly sessions are. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what exactly cookies are so you get a better understanding of how this is all going to work. So right now, in our application, we have the user saved to the database. Okay, now, the problem here is that if they were to visit any other route, let's say, for example, if they were to visit this get authenticated user controller route, even though they authorize, even though we save the data to the database, okay, we actually would not know who is making the request to any of our other routes. The reason why is because by default, HTTP is stateless. Every single call that is being made, it's a stateless call. Okay, now the way we solve that is we use something called cookies and sessions. Okay, so think of it like this. I'm sure you guys have heard of cookies before. Some of you guys may have heard of sessions as well. I know it might be a little bit confusing because I know when I first learned about this concept, it was quite confusing, but I'll try my best to explain it. So the way that it works is like this. We basically use cookies to send to the server every single time we want to make an authenticated request or some request that should provide the data of whoever is making that request. So cookies typically live on the browser or on the client side. When you make a request from the browser, okay, to the server, the cookies are sent to the server, okay? When it's sent to that server, the server will take that cookie and it'll check to see if that cookie actually is a valid cookie or not. Now, there's many approaches to this, but one common thing that occurs in like when you do it with Express, when you use libraries like Passport, is what happens is that session ID that lives on the server is being treated as the cookie ID. So the cookie ID lives on the client side, and that cookie ID is sent to the server. And what happens is that cookie ID is going to be searched in the database. It's going to check to see if that cookie is still valid. Valid as in if it has been expired already, if it already exists in the database, etc., etc. If it's valid, meaning that it has not expired, and it's also found in a database, then we can assume that that user is authenticated. If the cookie ID is not found in a database, and if it's been found but it's not expired, then that means that that call was invalid. Okay, so essentially the cookie ID, you can think of the cookie ID as the session ID. The cookie ID lives on the browser, but it can be used to make requests to the server, and the server can use that cookie ID to figure out who made that request. Now, don't get that confused because the server saves all of the data on the server side, right? There's no data saved on the client side other than the cookie itself. So session data typically is stored on the server side, which makes it a lot more secure than saving everything on the client side. So for example, the only thing that the client has is the cookie ID. They take the cookie, the server takes the cookie, exchanges that cookie, finds out who's making that request, and sends some kind of resource back indicating that the user in fact is authenticated with that cookie. And like I said, I know that's like a very general overview, but we're going to look at an example, and we're going to implement this from scratch so you get a better understanding of how everything works. So I hope that explanation made sense. But if it didn't make too much sense, don't worry. We're going to look at a simple example. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're basically going to need to set up sessions. So we're going to need to install Express Session. So I already have it installed. It's already in the repository already. But if you don't have it for whatever reason, just simply install it. Let me actually do this. Let me zoom in a little bit. Just simply do yarn add express session. And if you're using TypeScript, which I'm assuming most of you guys who are following this tutorial are, make sure you also install the types as well. Okay, so if I do yarn add express session, and then do yarn add -d at types express session, and now install the types. Okay, cool. So here's what we're going to do now. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to need to set up sessions. And to do that, we're going to need to register the session middleware. It's very, very simple. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to import session from express session. And then we're going to go ahead and right above the app.use/API, we're going to do app.use, and we're going to call that session, which is a function that takes in some options. So for the options, we're going to pass in a couple things. First, we're going to pass in the secret. So this is the secret that's going to be used to encrypt the session ID. So you can name it whatever you want. For now, I'm just going to do this, but obviously you probably would want to use something more secure for production. For now, we'll just use this random string. We're going to go ahead and you can also give the session a name too. So for example, I'll just call this Discord OAuth2 session ID. By default, the session name is connect, I think connect SID SID. So I think that's for session ID. And for the, let's see, we have the secret, we have the name. We are also going to provide the resave. So we'll set that to false, and save uninitialized, we'll set that to false. Basically, with save uninitialized, what that'll do is that will not save any sessions to the database unless the session object has been modified, but that also varies on what session store you use. So if you're using a session store, for example, if you use something like, I think, connect Mongo, for example, which is for MongoDB, that's going to configure it for that. But we're going to be saving the sessions ourselves, so we're not going to have to worry about any of that. And like I said, I'll show you guys how to set all that up. We're also going to set up our own serialization and deserialization functions. Okay. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to specify the cookie parameter. And what we'll do is we'll set the max age. I'll do, let's see, that's going to be 1 minute times 60. So actually I'll do 3600. Or let's see. It's 60 times 1 minute. So that'll be, I think it's 3,600,000. So that's going to be 1 hour, right? So that's 60,000 milliseconds, which is 1 minute, times 60 minutes. So that's 1 hour. And we'll do 1 hour times 24, so that's going to be 1 day. Okay? And yeah, so that'll be the max age of the cookie. So that's how long the cookie should live for. So it's basically gonna live for 1 day. The cookie's gonna live for 1 day. Okay. And that should pretty much do the trick. So let's go ahead and do a couple things right now. So now that we've set up the session, here's what we're gonna do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and visit the get authenticated user controller function. And I'm going to go ahead and log the session ID so you guys can actually see what it looks like. Okay, so now that I've started up my server again, and what we're going to do is we're basically going to visit that route that I mentioned. So that /API/auth/user route. And you're going to see it gives us a 200. But if we actually look in the logs now, you're going to see that we have this session ID. Now, every single time I visit this route, the session ID is going to change. And the reason why it's changing is because, like I said, we have save uninitialized set to false. If I actually set this to true, it actually won't change. So let's see. You're going to see that it's the same one every single time. And what happens is it essentially will, it basically will save the session, even though we didn't modify it at all. So you can see that it forces a session that is uninitialized to be saved to the store. And you can see that's why it's not generating a new session ID for us. Now, again, it depends on what your application needs, but typically you probably would not want to, you probably would not want to save the session, or you don't want to force a session to be saved if you don't have the user, like, for example, logging in. So you typically want to modify the session if the user is logging in. So we'll leave it by default to save initialize. So the user can stay unauthenticated and visit this route as many times, and it'll generate a new session ID. All right, so now if I go into the dev tools now, the Chrome dev tools, and if I go into cookies, let me zoom in a little bit. You're going to see that we have this cookie right over here, and this cookie is actually from, I think it was this one. Yeah. You can see that, let's see, this K7NG OK. Yeah. So the reason why it actually saved this cookie, even though we didn't even log in, is because we had save initialized to false. So if I actually clear this cookie, and if I refresh, you'll see that I never get a cookie even though I'm refreshing right now. You can see that I'm clearly refreshing the page and no cookie is being set. But if I set this to true, and if I refresh, you're going to see that we get a cookie. Now look what happens. I'll leave it for you guys to see. Pay close attention. So if I go into the logs, let me go into the logs. Look at the value of this cookie. 0FF and FROH, and you can see that values are over here. So this whole value, so everything starting from over here all the way up to this dot, basically that is actually our session ID that is going to be saved into the database. Okay, so what's going to happen is when we actually want to deserialize the user, which is basically taking the request, it's going to take the session ID, it's going to search the database, see which user belongs to the session ID, and it's going to do whatever it is that we need to do. That's the whole process of deserialization. And I'll explain a little bit more when we actually implement that function. But everything after this period, I think this is actually additional stuff that tells us how to decrypt the cookie, I think. I'm not too sure. But I know for a fact that this everything up to this dot is the actual session ID. You can see that it's literally being logged right over here. Okay. So now, essentially what happens is whenever we send a request to the server, it's going to basically give us, it's going to send these cookies there. Okay. But obviously we don't want this cookie to be set if the user does not log in. So we're going to set it back to save initialized. Okay, so now we're starting to understand a little bit more of what's actually happening underneath the hood when we implement sessions. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So now how do we actually, like, what do we actually do? Like, how do we actually modify the session now? Okay, so there's a couple ways that you can do this, but the way that we're going to do this is very simple. One, in order to modify the session, all we have to do is just reference request.session. Whoops, not inside here. In order to modify the session, all we really need to do is just do request.session. And there's a couple ways that we can modify it. So you can actually just set properties onto the session object. Now, there are a couple ways that you can modify the session. But since we're doing this in TypeScript, we do need to make sure that we extend the request object or the request type that comes from the Express library. And we also need to make sure we extend the Express session type that comes from the Express session library. Okay, because right now, if we try to modify the session directly, like if I did rec.session, and you can see that we only have a couple of methods and properties, but I can't dynamically attach the user to rec.session, and I also can't attach the user object to rec.user. To do this, we're going to need to do a couple things. So for Express session, what we can do is we can pretty much declare the module. So you can actually do this. You can actually create a file for this, also known as like a declaration file, and you can include that in the typings. But for now, I'll actually just leave this inside this index.ts file, and we'll fix that later. So what I'll do is I'll type declare module and then express session. And we're going to create the interface session data, which really actually there's an actual interface called session data that comes from express session. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're basically going to add the user property. Okay, and you're going to see how that's going to work. You're going to see what's going to happen. So if I do user, and now if I go over here, if I do rec.session.user, you can see that I can actually attach the appropriate properties. Now it's going to give us an issue because it's saying that these values are missing. Okay, and that's fine because we don't have a user yet. Now, what about rec.user though? Okay, we're trying to kind of mimic it. We're trying to mimic it like how Passport does it. So let's also extend the request to, and we're also going to need to get the user object from rec.user anyways. So we can do something similar to the way we're doing it with declare module express session. So if you want to extend the request as well, you can just do the same thing right over here with express. So for now, we're going to just leave this inside the index.ts. I don't think there's going to be anything else that we'll need to modify, any other namespace, so we'll just leave it alone for now. But you can actually Google how to create your own typing files with Express, and you typically probably want to put this in a separate folder. But I tried off camera, but it seems like I'm getting a lot of issues, so we'll just leave it over here for now. Okay, but you can see now I should be able to get the user. That should give us undefined, and we should be able to log the session ID. So if I refresh the page, you're going to see that it'll say undefined and the session ID. Okay, and if we were to modify the session, it'll give us whatever it is that we need. But we need to obviously first modify the session first. And to do that, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create our own serialize function. And the serialize function is basically going to take rec.session.user and it's going to update it to what it is that we need. So how do we do that? Well, in Passport, you'll actually notice that the serialize user and the deserialize user function, well, there's two functions that a lot of people aren't too familiar with, and I want to explain what exactly those functions do. So serialization is basically taking the user, and you basically are telling Passport how it wants to save the user to a database. So let me explain briefly what exactly is it that we're going to do with serializing and deserializing the session. So when the user first logs in, we need to serialize the user to the session, which is going to basically, it's basically going to be the way that we're going to save the user data to the session. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create a new record in the database. So that's also known as our session store, right? We're saving the session ID, and we're going to save we're also going to save when the session is going to expire. And we're also going to save which user it corresponds with. Okay, and that could literally be anything. So if you've used passport.deserialize user, if you actually pass in, so there's actually the done function, right? And you may have noticed that most of the time in most tutorials or most applications, it typically passes in the user object, and it'll actually pass in the user ID instead of the user object. Okay, and what happens is we can actually pass in the user ID. We can save that to the session. So we'll say, hey, look, this session corresponds with the user ID of 502. So when we deserialize, okay, and remember these two things work in hand, right? They work together. When we deserialize, we're going to take the cookie, search the database, and we're going to get that ID from that session, and we're going to search database for the user by the ID. And that's how we're going to know which user actually made that request. Okay, so essentially what we're going to do right now is we're going to go ahead and create our own serialize function. And like I said, once we actually create it, it'll make so much sense. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll go ahead and let's just create a file called it's called a session ts. And what we'll do is we'll create two functions. Export, let's call this async function, serialize session. And we'll create another function called deserialize session. Okay, so let's start with the simple one first, which is serialize session. And remember what this does is it literally is just going to take the session and save it to the database. Now, how do we do this? Well, first we're going to need the request, and we're going to need the response object. Okay, and really this function is actually just going to be a middleware that's going to be invoked. Okay, it's going to be invoked right before, I think, actually no, it'll be invoked probably, I think maybe after the controller for serialization, that is. Okay, and for deserialization is going to be invoked before we actually make the request. So here's what's going to happen. So for serialize session, what we're going to do is once everything is done, okay, once the user has authenticated, once they have logged in, we need to update the session. So what we do is we simply say, hey, look, you just logged in, okay? And what we want to do is we want to update the session. We want to basically modify rec.session.user, and we want to assign it to the user that corresponds to that session, and we'll also update rec.user as well. So that way for future requests, they can actually just easily reference that variable, and they'll know which user is which user is making these requests. So I think the best thing that we can do is we probably can just take in the request object, and we'll just take in the user object as well. Okay. And what we'll do is we'll simply just do rec.session.user is equal to user, and then rec.user equals user, and that should modify the session. And now we actually have to create the user in the, or not create the user, create the session in the database. So we're going to go ahead and get the session repository, but before we do that, we have to actually create a session entity, which is going to represent a session table. Okay, so let's create an entity. Let's call this sessions. And like I said, once you understand this, everything will make so much more sense, and we're almost there. So for the session, what we'll do is we'll create a primary column, and it's not going to be a primary generated column, it's going to be a primary column. And we'll just name the session ID, and it'll be a string, but we'll actually set the, I think we'll set the primary column to be a text. What we'll do next is we'll need the date that the session is going to expire. So we'll have a column, and we'll have the expires at, and this will be a date. It can also be like the you can also get the date in milliseconds too if you really want, but we'll just leave it as a date for now. Okay. And then finally we'll have a column, and for this one we'll do text as well, because we don't know how big the session can be. But for now we'll just simply say data, and this will be string. Okay. Cool. And if you always want to increase the size, I think you can actually increase the size as well. But we'll leave it as this for now. And keep in mind that the data can actually be anything. It's actually just going to be a JSON, but converted to string. So it's going to be a JSON string. And that JSON that's being converted to a string can be anything. It could be the user object, it can be the user ID, it can be anything. Okay. And like I said, now that you know how to implement your own sessions, you get full control of how you want to serialize and deserialize everything. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get the session repository. So we're going to import, not session, but session entity, like that. Now, before we do that, we also need to make sure we pass that session entity into the, into the entities array, like that. Okay. So it's gonna say, let's see, it's giving us an error. So it's trying to create. Oh, I see what's going on. You know what? Let's actually remove this text over here. Okay, there we go. That's better. Okay, so that should create a table called sessions in the SQL database. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna do const session equals await session repository, or actually wait, const session equals session repository create. So for the session ID, that'll just be rec.session ID. For the expires at, that'll be rec.session and .cookie expires. So this should be a date as well. And then finally the data. And like I said, this depends on how you want to serialize the session. So we'll do a couple of different ways. Right now, what we'll do is we'll stringify the user, and we'll save that. And we'll just simply do a session repository.save session, just like that. So this will save it to a database. Now, how do we want to invoke this? Well, I think what we'll do is we will invoke this by calling it inside auth Discord redirect controller. Typically, this should be actually a middleware. But I honestly think that you should only call this function when the user actually authorizes themselves. So this should actually be a middleware that should be called. Maybe I think after authorization. But we can always modify it. We can always modify it later. Okay. So let's pass in the two necessary objects. So it's actually gonna be new user. And let's log into our database. So MySQL. I think it's Discord OAuth2 DB. Okay, so let's go ahead and authorize now. So we're going to go ahead and authorize our application again. So you're going to see that we have all the data. Now let's actually see what happens after we authorize. You're going to see that we have a cookie. Okay. And let's actually double check the logs. Okay, everything seems to have been fine. Let's check the database now. You're going to see that we have our session table. It has the data, and it looks very similar. Like I said, it looks very similar to Passport. And if you're using your own session store, or if you're using like a session store that works with Express Session, you can see that we have everything saved. We have the date that it's that's going to expire on. So today is the 5th, and it's currently 5 a.m. So it's going to expire tomorrow, which is October 6th at 5 a.m. We have the session ID. You can see that we have the session ID over here, and we can tell that this session ID corresponds with the one that the cookie value. Okay, remember what I said earlier, that the session ID that is being sent back to the client, that gets saved as a cookie, like the ID itself, and we can use that to send it to the server, and we can use that to figure out who is making the request. So you can see this is the actual ID over here. Okay, you can see that they're the same thing. Okay, so now that we've saved the session to the database, now how do we actually ensure that we know subsequent requests are made by the user that just logged in? And that is where we need to implement the Deserialize Session function. Remember, Serialize Session, all that does is just it saves the session to the database however we want to save it. So if we want to save it to the database by saving the entire user, we can, and you can see what happens there. Though maybe you probably don't want to do that. You might just want to save the ID itself. So you can just simply do stringify ID user.id like that, or use the Discord ID. However way you do it, like I said, it's up to you. But for now, we'll just do it like this. Now let's go ahead and implement the Deserialize session, and this is actually going to be pretty fun to implement. So we're going to, this is actually going to be, I think, a middleware function. And what we're going to do is this function is going to be responsible for basically, it's going to be called before every single function. Okay? Before every single controller function. So before auth Discord redirect, before get authenticate user, before get revoke X token, this function is going to be called every single time. So it's basically a middleware function. Okay? And what we're going to do is we're basically going to go ahead and check to see if rec.user is defined. So for example, what we'll do is we'll say if rec.user, we'll console log rec.user. And if it's not, we will just say user not logged in. Well, here's what I'm going to do. Is since we already set since we modified the session, actually I should have done that first, so I apologize. So let me do this real quick, okay? So what I'm going to do is let me actually do this. Since we already modified the session already, let me go ahead and log the session ID, and let me go ahead and log the user as well. Now before I call Serialize Session, and remember, like I said, the whole point of these videos is we always want to test everything as much as we can, like show the before and after. So let's go ahead and authorize. Now let me go ahead and visit that user route real quick, okay? Now if we look in the logs, you're going to see that we're going to have it's going to be undefined, and you're going to see the session IDs over there. And if I refresh, it's going to be a different session ID. Now watch what happens if I call Serialize Session. Okay, so if I call this function, let's go back and authorize again. Now watch what happens if I visit that user route. You're going to see that every single time I refresh, it's going to give us the same exact, the same exact session ID. But you're also going to notice that the rec.user is undefined. Okay, and the reason why it's undefined is because we have not implemented the deserialized session yet. Remember, the deserialized session is responsible for actually taking the user and attaching it to the rec.user object. So actually, we don't even need to do this. We actually don't even need to do rec.user equals user. We actually only need to modify the session object itself. If I actually logged rec.session, this would actually be a lot better. So let me do this. So right now it should be undefined because we haven't modified the session yet. It's going to give us a different session ID. But if I reauthorize, okay, it calls serialize session. It modifies the session object. And if I go to that user route, you're going to see that we now have the user inside the session object. Okay, and since the session has been modified, every single time I visit this route, the user is going to exist in the session object. And like I said, you don't have to do rec.user if you don't want to. But like I said, we're just trying to mimic Passport as much as we can. If you want to just reference rec.session.user, you can do that. But you'll see that the session ID never changes because we just modified already. And that session ID is saved in the database. It's hard to tell because I have a lot of stuff on my screen, but let's see, 371. Yep, it's right over here, or 37I. Okay, so this session ID is right over here, and it tells you the time that the session will expire in. Okay, so now the reason why rec.user is undefined is because, like I said, rec.user needs to be set with deserialized session. Okay, so what we're going to do is every single time we make a request to any of the protected routes, it's going to call deserialized session. So what we can do is we can actually take this deserialized session function and we can register it as a middleware. We can actually register it globally. Okay, so what we can do is we can actually just call app.use and register deserialized session. So let's see, I have deserialized session imported up there, so I'll just simply do app.use, pass in the serialized session. Now I think it's going to give us an error because it's saying that default is not found. Now I'm not sure why. Oh, actually I know why. Yeah, it's the same problem that we had earlier because we're manually importing everything. So for now, I'll do this. Let's see, utils session. For now, I will just dynamically import everything that I need. Because right now it's trying to get the repository before the connection has been established. Okay, so watch this. If I make request to here, you're gonna see that it actually is gonna call deserialized session. Okay, and the server is not going to respond with anything because we haven't done anything yet. Now, there's actually a third parameter for middleware functions. So actually for every function, even the controller function, there's always a third parameter that's optional, and that parameter is called next. And this is just a function, so for now, I'll type annotate as function. And essentially, next should be called whenever you have a bunch of middleware that needs to go to the next middleware function. Even the controller function itself is technically a middleware. So for example, this deserialized session function is going to be called, and we should do stuff right after something happens, right? So for example, what we want to do is we want to call next no matter what, because deserialized session is not responsible for anything else other than getting the database, getting the session from the database and attaching it to whatever it is that we attach to, for example, rec.user. Okay, so for example, we'll call next, and this will literally go to the next function, the next middleware. So if you've used Express before, this should make sense. So I'll show you as we go on. So let's go over here. If I reload, you'll see that we call next, and you can see that we get a response from the server. That's because when we call next, it'll literally go down to the next function that should be called, which is really just another middleware. Okay, so this middleware is going to be registered for every single route. And before these functions are called, before this auth Discord redirect controller is going to be called, let me go over here. Before this is called, the Deserialize Session function is going to be called. So if I actually don't register it globally, and if I were to register it for just a route, you'll see that the Serialize Session would be called first, and then it'll call auth Discord redirect controller. Okay, but we're registering globally, which is what we should do, and I think that's actually what Passport does as well. So what we're going to do, every single request, no matter what, we're always going to search a database to see if there is a user with that session. So let me actually do this. Let me go ahead and console log rec.session ID, and you're going to see that among every single request that I make, it's always going to give me a session ID. It's going to log it twice, okay, because we have it also logged inside over here. But no matter what request I make, if I go to /auth/user, if I go to /auth/revoke, it's going to give me the session ID. Okay, now you're going to see that it says user not logged in, and that's correct because there's no user. Now you're going to see that it says user not logged in, but actually this if else case is actually incorrect. I apologize. This should actually be what's done if you want to check to see if the user is authenticated, but we need to actually deserialize the session first. So this is actually wrong. What we need to do is we need to take the session ID, we need to search a database. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const session db equals await session repository, find one. And we're going to find by the session ID. So rec.session ID. And so what's going to happen is we should do a couple checks, right? We should check to see if the session DB's date, if it's expired. Because remember, session DB has the property called expires at, and this is a date. Okay, this is a date. And you want to check to see if the session expired or not. Okay, but let me actually note that down real quick. So it's actually very easy to check to see if the session expired, because all we can do is we can just do if new date. So we can actually just create a date right now. So for example, const date or current time equals new date. And we can do if current time or if, sorry, not current time, if session db dot expires at. So we can check to see if this is less than current time. Okay, now it's giving us an error. I don't know why it's saying possibly undefined. I think it's because this itself is possibly undefined, but it shouldn't be. But for now, what we'll do, what we'll do is we'll do this. We'll do that. Okay. So what we'll do is check to see if session.db.expires at is less than the current time. So if that is the case, right? So if the current time right now, let's say right now it's 5 a.m., right? And if the time of expires at is less than the current time right now, that means the session expired, right? So it's a time in the past. So that means the session expired. Session expired. So we'll have to do a couple things. We should also delete the session too. But we'll not do that. We'll do that later, okay? So if the session is not expired, so if the session is not expired, we won't delete the session, obviously. And what we'll do is we'll get the data that we need from the database. Remember, like I said, this depends on how you serialized it. So however you serialize the session is how that should be deserialized as well. So for example, we're basically going to take the data from, let's see, we're going to take the data from session db dot data. I don't know why. Oh, I understand why now. Hold on, let me fix that real quick. If there's no session db, oh, I get it. It's because it can't be found. So if it's not found, then we won't really do anything. Okay, so if there's no session db, we'll just call next. Okay, and literally what will happen is it will go on to the next call, remember this function is not responsible for checking to see if the user is authenticated. We'll write additional middleware for that, okay? So if there's no session DB, we'll just go to the next call, and then we'll handle that accordingly when we get to that, okay? So now everything else, I think we don't need this anymore. I don't know why it's still doing that, because if there's no session DB, oh, this is some flawed logic right over here. Okay, there we go. I guess we need an else case. Oh, I know why. It's because... There we go. That should be better. Okay, cool. So if the expires at is less than current time, session expired. If it's not expired, what we'll do is we'll take the data. And remember, data is a string. We'll parse it. Okay, and then we'll basically do rec.user equals data. Okay, and we can also say that this was serialized as well, but actually it's actually a bit tricky because remember, like I said, you can serialize a session however you want, but the rec.user might not always have all the properties. It might not always have every single property of the user because it depends on how you serialize it. Okay, but I think this should be fine for now. And we can just simply call next. So if the session expired, we can call next as well. You know, let me actually do this too. Do this. Remember, next is going to be called no matter what. So we'll just call it right over here. Okay. So let's try this out now. So what we're going to do is we know that Deserialized session has been registered as a middleware globally. So right now what we're going to do is we're not going to authenticate. Or actually, I think we should still be authenticated, because if we actually look inside here, if we look inside the cookie, we should still have the cookie in the database. Okay, this cookie over here. Let's double check that real quick. So let's go ahead and select session. So we should still have that in the database somewhere. Let's see, did it save? Yep, right over here. I think it's an LFOQ. LFOQ, okay. And it hasn't expired yet. So technically, if I were to visit any route right now, it should deserialize properly. So let's see what happens. So it's the same cookie, okay, but it's giving undefined, which is quite interesting. So you can see that we still have the cookie right over here, but it's giving us, let's see, it's giving us an undefined, which is, wait, did it even call the Serialized session? Hold on, wait. Because it should have logged something real quick. Let me see something. I should always log this session. Okay, so it didn't log anything. That's quite interesting. Let's try it again. So it says no session. So it seems like it's not able to find the session. Why is that? Is it because of the session ID? Because let's see, if I do rec.session ID, maybe session ID is incorrect. Okay, I know why. The reason why, okay, yeah, I know why. Okay, so the reason why is because what's happening here is, okay, so here's what's happening. I think it might be because we aren't modifying the session as well. All right, so what the problem here is that we actually need to use cookie parser in Express so we can actually get the cookies that are being sent. Because remember, the cookies are the main credentials. Without those, we can't actually know what the user is sending to us. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to install cookie parser. So let's do that, cookie parser. Okay. And let's see. So we just did that, yarn add cookie parser. Okay. And like I said, a library like Passport does literally all of this stuff for you, which is why you probably never have to even worry about any of these things. So yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to use cookie parser, and this is going to allow us to parse cookies. Okay, because right now we aren't, if you actually try to log the cookies to the console, it actually won't even, it actually will just pop up as undefined. Okay, so if I actually refresh, you're going to see that it says undefined over here. I have the app on my other screen, but I'm just showing you guys. You can see that it's being logged over here, undefined, because there are no cookies. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to import cookie parser. So let's do that. So import cookie parser from cookie parser. I think we also need to install the types as well. So let's do that. Yarn add types cookie parser. Okay. There we go. So I should fix that. And then we can register the middleware. So we'll do that right over here. App.use cookie parser. Right there. Okay, so that should, I think that should be all we need to do. So if I refresh now, you're going to see that I have this cookie over here. Okay, now if I were to actually set another cookie on the client, which I'm going to do right now. So you can see that if I were to set my own cookie, so let's say if I do something like, I don't know, is auth, and then I set that to true, you're going to see that if I refresh the page, that cookie is going to be there and the cookies are going to be parsed. But we only care about the Discord OAuth2 session cookie. Okay, now this might be a little bit tricky, but let's do this. So we're going to go ahead and get that cookie over there. And let's console log that. Okay. And if I refresh, I should be able to just see that cookie over there. Now you're going to see there's also another problem too, is the problem here is that we have this whole string over here. But how do we actually get the actual ID? Like we don't want to do any like tokenization and stuff, right? So what we can do is we can actually parse the cookie because this cookie is encrypted. But what we can do, I think we can actually just pass in the secret into cookie parser. So I think it's like this. Yeah. So I think it's secret first, and I think that should probably decrypt the cookie for us. Because right now, this cookie itself, I think it's like the signed cookie instead. It's a signed cookie itself, but there's actually a function that we can use, and it'll return the unsigned value. Okay, and this is why it's very important that you keep the cookie secret a secret. Okay, but we can use this secret to get the actual unsigned value of the cookie. So the way we do that is very simple. We can simply just, well, first we're going to get the Discord OAuth2 session ID. Okay, we already logged that over here. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're basically going to import cookie parser. So cookie parser, we're going to import that again. And we're basically going to do this. Let's just call this session ID. And we're going to cookie parser dot sign cookie. And we're going to pass in the cookie itself. So Discord OAuth2 session ID. And then we're going to pass in the secret. So it might be worth storing the secret, like I said, in an environment variable or somewhere secure. And if I go ahead and log session ID, so we're going to go ahead and restart the server. I'm going to go on my app. I'm just going to refresh it. You're going to see that I now actually get the ID of the cookie. Okay, and that's what I want. So before, the problem was that we weren't parsing the cookies. I forgot that we actually need to parse the cookies in order for this to work. Okay, so let's go ahead and take the session ID. We're going to go ahead and take this, pass it in there, and it's giving us an error because it's not an actual string. Okay, because signed cookie returns something else. So we're going to call toString. Okay, and now it shouldn't say no session anymore. The session should be found in the database. So let's go ahead and log everything. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh, and I'll pay close attention to the logs right now. Okay, I'm going to refresh. You're going to see that now we have a lot of stuff. Let's see what happened. So let's walk through this. I just made a request to the app, to the route. You're going to see that the session ID was logged right over here, and that session ID is the same session ID from over here. Remember, this is the cookie value. On the server, we got the unsigned value of the cookie. You don't want to do that on the client. You want to do that stuff on the server. Okay. So we got the unsigned value of the cookie, which is this part over here. Okay, so that's being logged. The session was found. You can see the session is being logged in the database. Okay, the session was found. You can see the time that the session expires. You can see that it says session not expired, which is good. Okay. And you can see that once it said session not expired, we parse the data and we set rec.user to data. Now watch what happens if I refresh. Every single time I refresh, it's going to go ahead and run through this logic over here, this deserialized session. Okay. Now, if I go into the actual endpoint, and let me actually get rid of all of these logs, because I know there's a lot of stuff. So it makes it kind of difficult to figure out what's what. So let me just comment out everything. And we're on the auth/user route. So if I refresh, you're going to see that every single time I refresh, in the logs, it's actually being logged over here. But I can actually just do this, rec.user. Okay, so if I refresh, every single time I refresh, I have the user, I know who's being authenticated. I know who's authenticated. Now, notice how the server is also restarting every single time too. We're literally restarting the server as we're making changes. And you can see that it's persistent now. That we know who's accessing our resources. We know who's accessing our endpoints. If I try to go to the revoke access token, or if I try to access the revoke URL, it does the same thing. It literally runs through the deserialize session function every single time. Okay, so that's literally similar to what's happening underneath the hood with passports, serialize, and deserialize session. Okay, now I'm not sure exactly how they do it, but I guarantee you this is one of the ways that you can do it. Okay, now let's go ahead and do one more thing. Let's make sure that everything works the way that we expect it to. So what we're going to do is, let's actually do this. Let's do some testing as well. Let me actually delete all the cookies here. Now, if I refresh, you're going to see that the server is going to actually throw an error, and that's because rec.user... Well, actually, the reason why it throws an error is because... what's going on here? It's saying, can I read property to string of undefined? So what we need to do is we need to actually add some additional middleware, or maybe add some additional checks. So we should probably also check to see if the cookie is not present. So for example, if this is not there, we should probably call next as well, just so that it goes to next. I think maybe the best thing that we should do is we should probably move this to a different function, but for now we'll do that. So if there's no session ID, it'll go to next, and we'll just pass that down to the controller and see what they want to do. Because like I said, there are routes that might not need to be authenticated, that might not require the user to be authenticated. So you don't want to do any logic in here that might prevent that from happening. Like if you're building your own like authentication library, you don't want to do that. So if there's no session ID, we'll just pass it down to the controller and let the controller handle it. Okay. If there is one, we'll parse it, we'll find it. If there's no session, we'll call next. So I think this should actually fix that issue. So if I refresh, we should still get a response. But you can see that right now, rec.user is actually undefined. So what we can do here is we can say, hey, look, if rec.user return res, actually, let's do this. Return rec.user. So if rec.user will send a 200, else we'll send a 403 or 401 rather. And let's do that with both. And you'll see what's going to happen. Actually, I'll send rec.user if the user is authenticated instead. Now watch this. If I refresh, it's going to say unauthorized. It gives us a 403. Okay, or 401, sorry. And yeah, that's pretty much how it works. So let's go ahead and let me do one more thing. Let me delete all these sessions in the database, and we're going to do this. Let's go ahead and set the session. Let's make it expire after 10 seconds so we can actually make sure that if the session is expired, we should do a couple things. One, we should delete it from the database. Two, we should ensure that the user is not authenticated. So we actually don't even do anything, which is good. Because like I said, typically the browser actually, I think the browser typically will remove cookies if the cookie is expired, because there's usually this expired column over here that will keep track of when the cookie expires. So I think if the cookie is expired and the cookie still lives on the database, it actually won't even send it, I think. I'm not 100% sure, but I know I've heard of that before. So what we're going to do here is we also want to make sure that we don't keep expired sessions on the database. So we'll delete them whenever we can. But you also might want to write a function that deletes cookies periodically, just so that the database is not populated with a bunch of unused sessions or expired sessions too. So what we'll do, if the session exists, so this over here is where the session exists, but the session is expired. We'll delete the session. So I think we can just do session.db, or actually I think we'll just do await session repository that deletes. And I think we can just pass in session db like this, and that should delete it. And I'll console log session deleted. And like I said, the whole purpose of this function is to just deserialize. We're not trying to check to see if the user is authenticated or not. So we're always going to pass it down to the controller to do whatever it is they need to do when it comes to authentication. Well, and when it comes to check and see if the user is authenticated or not. So right now, we're going to go ahead. Now, if I refresh, let's see. Okay, let's go ahead and log in now. So we're going to have to re-authenticate again. So you're going to see right over here on the screen, I'm going to click authorize. So good, that took me over here, and you're going to see that in the database, the session exists, and you can see that it expires literally, it actually just expired right now as we speak, because the current time is 5:45 a.m. And you can see that if I actually try to visit the user route, it's going to say unauthorized. And let's see what happened. In the logs, it should have actually said session deleted. Though I'm not sure why it didn't, but let's see. The session seemed like the session did not deleted, but when I go to /user, oh, I know why. So I think what I was saying was right earlier. You can see that if the session is expired, the browser actually will just remove not the session. If the cookie is expired, the browser will actually just remove it. So it actually won't even send it at all. I think, yeah, it actually won't even send the cookie at all. But yeah, I think this if condition should work though, no matter what. I think, yeah, because that is the right way that you can check to see if the date is less than the current time, which means that the session expired already. So that should delete it from the database. Okay. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's pretty much all there is to it when it comes to sessions. Obviously, there's a lot of other things that we probably not cover, but this is the general basis. And now you know how it works underneath the hood. And you literally don't even need to use Passport anymore, because you can implement your own sessions. You can literally just use Express Session, and you can serialize and deserialize your session however you want. Okay, and now we can literally create our own routes to protect whatever it is that we want. Okay, I'm trying to think if there's any other things any other problems that we might run into. Because like I said, the Serialized session will be called every single time, but it's not really going to affect this auth Discord redirect controller. Okay, because remember, this function is going to be called whenever we visit this redirect route, and we can literally reauthorize as many times as we want, and it won't really affect anything at all. Okay, every single time we authorize, it's just going to serialize the session again, and it'll literally just create a new session. But we should also add some logic, because let's say, for example, if the user already has a session, do we want to create a new session in the database, or do we want to update the session? Because right now, let's see what happens here. So right now, let's go into the database and let's actually reauthorize again. So let's click authorize, and you're gonna see that a new session should be created. Yep, there we go. But if we try to reauthorize a user, what happens here? You're gonna see that it's gonna create, or actually, it seems like it did not create a new session. I think it's because, you know what? I think it's because we are using the same session ID to create the user, but I don't know if so it doesn't actually update the session at all. So if the user, so that's actually bad, because right now, if we reauthorize, that technically means that it should create a new session. Like what it should do is it should actually update the session's time. So we actually should handle that case. I think you can do that by doing rec.session, and you can actually modify by doing, I think you can actually do touch, and it should update the max age property. But the session where middleware does it for you. But I'm trying to see if there's a max age that we can actually just set manually. But yeah, I think if you actually, let me actually see, rec.session.max. Let's see, touch. So this actually will, let me see. It says updates the max age property. So I think this should actually, I think what this will do is it will actually change the, yeah, I think it will update the max age for you. So it should actually update the, I think it should actually reset the time. We can actually double check. So let's see, right now we are authenticated, and we can see that this cookie expires tomorrow at 5:48 a.m. So this is 12:48. I think that's in UTC time. So to reauthorize again. So if I look over here, you can see that the cookie was updated, and it now says 12:50. So it was updated by 2 minutes. Okay, but let's see if the server updated that, and the server actually seems like the server did in fact update it. Seems like it created a new one. But it gave a new cookie. It gave a new cookie ID. I think that's actually what we want. So let's double check, make sure everything else works fine. So that works. Good. Good. And let's go back and let's reauthorize again. So that will create a new cookie. And that will, let's see, it seems like it didn't create a new cookie for this one. I'm not sure why. It created a new one previously, but right now it did not, which is very strange why that'd be the case. That's very interesting, because we are calling Serialize user again. I'm not sure why the session did not get updated. That's really interesting. So yeah, I think they're definitely, so it seems like when I restart the server, and it seems like whenever I restart the server, rec.session touch will be modified. I actually will need to read a little bit about this. So for now, I'm actually going to remove this, and I'll leave a note later. I don't want to, do too much right now, but I think we have the general basis covered. Just make sure you guys look into documentation and cover any scenarios that we may have not covered. But yeah, that's going to be pretty much it for this whole tutorial. I told you guys it was going to be pretty lengthy, but definitely a lot of information covered. So yeah, that's pretty much it when it comes to serializing and deserializing the session. Really all it is just saving the session to a database, saving any additional data. If we need to modify the session, we can always modify the session by literally doing rec.session and attaching anything that we need. So let's say, for example, you have a cart system that has items, right? You can always modify the session however you want. And like I said, it's important that we talk about how we do this underneath the hood, because once you understand how this is done, you can literally use these libraries to your advantage. The problem that I had when I first started out learning all of these libraries was I didn't know what was going on, and it took some time to actually understand what was going on. So when you actually go into other libraries and use other frameworks and use other, RESTful APIs, you actually know how to do all of these things manually, so you can actually handle it yourself. Now, would I recommend doing it yourself when there's already libraries that do it well for you? I would not recommend that because libraries typically do a good job. But if you are eager enough to implementing your own, let's say a library does not satisfy your needs, then definitely create your own. And maybe even add extra functionalities too. So that way it'll literally fit your needs. It'll fit your project needs. So anyways, that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Okay, and if you guys did, definitely leave a like, leave a comment, and definitely subscribe. It helps the channel out a lot. And if you guys want to, you guys can join the channel as a member. That's completely optional. You don't have to, but I figured I'd mention that because I am putting in a lot of work into these videos and making sure that you guys are learning. And if you guys definitely did learn, that's good news. Okay, so that's going to be pretty much it for this whole video. I think there's really not much there's left to cover. In the next video, it'll be a shorter video. I'll simply just tell you guys how we can protect our routes. But I think you guys have a general idea on how to do that. But if there's anything else, I'll make a follow-up video and upload it. So I'll see you guys in my next video. The code, like I said, will be in the description. If you guys need any help, leave a comment down below or join the Discord server. There's a link in the description and you can go on there and ask for help. So I'll see you guys in my next video. Peace out.